In 1878, archaeologists excavating a burial mound on the island of Birka in central Sweden found a warrior's grave. A game board for tactical strategy lay to one side, the kind used not for entertainment, but for practicing command decisions. 2 horses had been sacrificed and placed in the chamber. The burial contained a sword, a shield, an axe, a spear, and a full quiver of arrows. This was not symbolic placement. This was equipment for a person who fought and commanded at a high level. The burial was catalogued as BJ 581. It was identified as a male warrior without question. The weapons made the determination. The interpretation appeared in academic papers, in textbooks, in lecture slides across the field. BJ 581 became one of the most cited Viking Age warrior burials in the archaeological literature. The identification stood for 130 years. In 2017, a team of archaeologists and geneticists published a DNA analysis of the skeletal remains. The warrior of BJ 581 was a woman, not a woman buried with a warrior's symbolic objects. A woman buried as a warrior, with the same status markers, the same strategic game board, the same pair of sacrificed horses. The osteological analysis had raised the possibility years earlier. The DNA confirmed it beyond dispute. The researchers noted something specific in their published paper. The assumption of male identity had been so structurally embedded in how the grave had been read that physical traits pointing away from male sex had been reinterpreted, unconsciously, repeatedly, to fit the existing conclusion. The field had been reading the evidence through the model. The model was wrong. That single grave opened a larger case, because BJ 581 was not an exception, it was a signal. The image most people hold of a Viking is coherent and well-sourced. Tall, fair, northern. A raider from Scandinavia, Norwegian, Danish, or Swedish, arriving on foreign coastlines with weapons and a recognizable cultural identity that was bounded, legible, and ethnically consistent. The historical sources supported this picture. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles recorded the raids. The Irish annals described the longships. The sagas were composed in Iceland. The Norse settlements left place names visible across Scotland, the north of England, and Ireland to this day. The genetics appeared to confirm it. Modern Scandinavian populations carry markers traceable to the Viking Age. The connection between ancestry and identity seemed straightforward. The problem was structural. The framework was doing interpretive work that the evidence was not actually doing. The same error as BJ 581 at a much larger scale. In 2020, a research team led by Ashot Margarian published a study in Nature that sequenced the genomes of 442 individuals from Viking Age burial sites across Europe and the North Atlantic. The sample covered approximately 400 years of the Viking Age, drawn from sites in Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Ukraine, Poland, and the Eastern Mediterranean. It is the largest ancient DNA study of the Viking world ever conducted. The results did not confirm the established model. They fractured it. The first finding was about cultural identity. Significant numbers of individuals buried with Viking-style grave goods, weapons, ship rivets, animal sacrifice, were not genetically Scandinavian. Some were locally born British or Irish individuals who had been absorbed into or adopted the cultural and military network. The grave goods had told one story. The DNA told another. The second finding was about the populations themselves. Viking Age Scandinavia was genetically more varied than modern Scandinavian populations. The study identified individuals in Viking Age Denmark with genetic ancestry traceable to southern Europe and the Levant, not as isolated anomalies, but across multiple sites and time periods. The genetic monoculture of the popular image, the blonde northern homogeneity, was a later simplification of a genuinely mixed population. The third finding was the conceptual break. Viking was not an ethnicity, it was an activity. The word derives from Old Norse. To go Viking was to go on a raid, on a voyage, on an expedition. It was a verb before it became a noun. Viking identity was enacted, not inherited. The genetic evidence supports exactly this. People from different ancestries and different homelands participated in the same cultural and military network. The ships carried crews that the mythology had never described accurately. The genetic diversity the 2020 study found was not a surprise to linguists and historians who had read the primary sources carefully. It was a surprise to a popular narrative that had flattened those sources into a single coherent ethnic image. That image is now retired. What replaces it is more complex and more interesting. The genetic trail runs westward and eastward. Both routes reach unexpected endpoints. To the west, Iceland. The island was settled in a narrow window, roughly 870 to 930 AD, and the founding population has been reconstructed with unusual precision using ancient and modern DNA. Male lineages in Iceland trace to Scandinavia in approximately the proportions the sagas described. The female lineages do not. Around 60% of Icelandic female genetic lineage traces to the British Isles and Ireland. The Norse settlers brought or took women from Britain and Ireland in numbers large enough to shape the entire genetic inheritance of a modern nation. DNA from Viking Age burials in Norway confirms that this mixing began before Iceland was even settled. The founding population arrived already genetically hybrid, carrying Scandinavian and Gaelic ancestry in the same bodies. The crossing to Iceland was made by people who were already the product of contact and interbreeding across multiple generations. This matters beyond the history. Iceland's genetic record is one of the most precisely documented founding events for any modern population. The specific lineages that made that 60-year settlement window are traceable. Every person of Icelandic ancestry alive today carries the inheritance of that event, in proportions that can be estimated from their genome, not ancestry in a metaphorical sense. Base pairs from named genetic populations laid down in a named century. To the east, the Varangians. Byzantine and Arab sources from the 9th and 10th centuries describe traders and mercenaries from the north, referred to as Rus or Varangians, who established trade routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, founded the political structures that eventually became Russia and Ukraine, and staffed the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. The Arab geographer Ibn Fadlan met them on the Volga in 922 AD and left one of the most detailed first-person accounts of Norse culture that exists anywhere in the written record. The genetic evidence confirms the eastern route. Studies of Viking Age burials from Poland, Ukraine, and sites along the Volga trade routes have identified individuals with unambiguously Scandinavian genetic ancestry, buried thousands of kilometers from any fjord, at precisely the period the historical sources describe. The Norse network was not a coastal phenomenon. It ran from Newfoundland to Constantinople. Consider what that geographic range means in terms of genetic mixing. At the western end, Scandinavian settlers were interbreeding with British and Irish populations for generations before founding Iceland. At the eastern end, Norse traders and mercenaries were living inside Byzantine and Kievan Rus society, marrying into local populations, leaving genetic traces that studies of modern Eastern European populations are still tracing. The genetic signature of the Viking Age is not a neat cluster on a population map. It is a smear across an entire hemisphere, diluted by subsequent history, but not erased. Here is where this stops being history. If you have ancestry from northeast England, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, the former Danelaw territories, a portion of that genetic inheritance is Viking Age. The signal is measurable in modern populations from those regions at levels above what would be expected from ordinary demographic mixing over the same period. Orkney and Shetland carry Scandinavian ancestry in the range of 25 to 30% in current studies. That is not diffuse continental heritage. That is a direct legacy of Norse settlement that never fully dissolved, in populations that have been in those islands continuously for over 1,000 years. If you have Irish ancestry from the eastern coastal cities, Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, the genetic signal of Norse settlement is detectable in modern populations from those regions, layered into what was already present and what came later. If you have Icelandic ancestry, the founding population that made that crossing has been studied so precisely that the specific genetic lineages are identifiable. You are descended from a known mixing event. The mixture is in you. The broader point is this. The people whose genes appear in modern British, Irish, Icelandic, and Eastern European populations were not a single coherent ethnic group moving as a unit. They were a network. Scandinavian-born and locally born, Norse and Gaelic and Slavic and more, operating under a shared cultural architecture, moving across an extraordinary geography, mixing at every point along the route. The Viking Age left a genetic mark on modern Europe not because one bounded people conquered a continent. It left that mark because one network connected a continent. And what networks produce, genetically, is mixture. The diversity the 2020 study found in Viking Age Scandinavia was not the exception to the Viking story, it was the Viking story. The Greenland Norse colony is one of the open leads. It was established around 985 AD by Eric the Red, survived for roughly 500 years, and then ended without a surviving community and without clear documentary evidence of how. The most recent confirmed Norse occupation of Greenland dates to approximately 1400 AD. After that, silence. No final document. No account of departure or catastrophe. Ancient DNA from Greenlandic Norse remains confirms the expected Icelandic founding admixture, Scandinavian and British Isles ancestry, in the proportions the Icelandic founding event would predict. What is not present in the current evidence is genetic admixture with the Thule Inuit, who were living in Greenland and expanding into Norse-occupied territory during the colony's final centuries. Two populations, present in the same geography for potentially 200 years, and the genetic record currently shows no trace of contact between them. Why the colony ended, and why two populations occupying the same landscape left no measurable genetic trace on each other, remains unresolved. The diversity question also has open leads. The 2020 study identified Southern European and Levantine ancestry in Viking Age Scandinavian burial populations. The routes by which those lineages arrived, through Bronze Age migration patterns, through the Varangian trade network, through individual movement that the historical record does not document, are still being traced. The population history of Scandinavia in the centuries immediately before and after the Viking Age is still being assembled from fragments. The Birka warrior case is closed, the larger case is not. In 1878, a grave was assigned a gender based on its contents. The assumption held for 130 years. When DNA was applied, the assumption was wrong. The same pattern played out at scale. Viking Age populations, examined through 442 ancient genomes, are more diverse, more mixed, and more operationally fluid than the historical model had described. The ethnic coherence was not a finding, it was a projection, reinforced by a framework that had not been examined against the evidence it claimed to rest on. The raids, the settlements, the trade routes from Scandinavia to the Arab world, these happened. The people who carried them out were real. What DNA has clarified is what those people actually were. Not a single ethnic bloc, but a network with genetic inputs from across Europe and beyond, leaving traces in modern populations from Reykjavik to the Volga. The warrior in the Birka grave was identified by what she carried. For 130 years, the identification was wrong. Not maliciously, systematically. The model had replaced the evidence. That pattern, reading what you expect until a genome arrives and shows you something else, is the history of what we thought we knew about the Vikings. The model has been revised, the revision is not finished.